Daniel Harper stood in front of the bathroom mirror at home, adjusting a tie he rarely wore. The invitation had been clear, attendance strongly encouraged. It wasn't framed as optional, even if it came wrapped in polite corporate language. He checked the time again, already calculating how long he could stay before needing to get back. Ethan was with a neighbor, and Daniel hated that familiar knot in his chest that came from choosing work over home, even temporarily. The venue was louder than he expected, filled with polished laughter and the low hum of conversations that meant nothing yet carried weight. Daniel entered quietly, nodding at familiar faces, offering short smiles. He wasn't there to network or impress. He was there to be counted. Visibility mattered in ways performance reviews never fully captured, and he'd learned that lesson the hard way over the years. As he moved through the room, he felt slightly out of place, like a guest who had arrived too early or too late. Conversations brushed past him without sticking. He kept his drink untouched, knowing he needed a clear head. Somewhere between the speeches and the background music, he reminded himself this was temporary. An hour, maybe less. Then he could leave with his conscience somewhat intact. Daniel's phone vibrated in his pocket, a short message from the neighbor saying Ethan was fine, already asleep. Relief washed over him, followed by guilt. He told himself that stability required sacrifice, even when it didn't feel fair. Being a single dad meant constantly justifying choices no one else seemed to question when made by others. He noticed Melissa Grant across the room, surrounded by executives, perfectly composed as always. She caught his eye briefly and smiled, a quick acknowledgement that lingered longer than expected. Daniel looked away first. Their interactions had always been professional, efficient, but lately there had been something else, an intensity he couldn't quite define or dismiss. The formalities dragged on, awards given, applause delivered on cue. Daniel clapped when expected, laughed when appropriate. He was performing a version of himself that fit the room, even if it felt distant from who he really was. Every minute stretched, making him more aware of how thin his patience had become. When the crowd shifted toward the bar, Daniel stepped back, finding a quiet corner near the hallway. He checked the time again. Soon, he told himself, just a few more minutes. He exhaled slowly, unaware that the evening was already moving in a direction he hadn't planned for and couldn't yet see coming. Behind him, footsteps approached, deliberate and unhurried. Daniel turned slightly, expecting small talk or a polite goodbye. Instead, he met Melissa's gaze, closer now, more focused. "Daniel," she said softly, as if the noise around them didn't exist. "Can we talk for a moment?" Melissa led him a few steps away from the main floor, not fully secluded, but far enough that the music softened. The conversation began harmlessly, comments about turnout, budget cycles, the usual surface-level talk. Yet her tone was different, slower, more deliberate. She maintained eye contact longer than necessary, as if measuring something in him. Daniel answered politely, keeping his responses short, trying to steer things back to neutral ground. She asked about Ethan, not in the casual way colleagues sometimes do, but with detail. How old he was now, whether school schedules were still a challenge, if Daniel was managing on his own. He felt the shift immediately. These weren't questions tied to productivity or deadlines. They crossed into territory he usually kept guarded, and he wasn't sure when he had given permission for that door to open. Daniel smiled where expected, but his shoulders tightened. He wondered if he was overreading the moment. Melissa had always been perceptive, known for remembering things others forgot. Still, this felt different. Her voice lowered slightly, forcing him to lean in to hear her. He didn't like that instinctive closeness, the way it blurred lines he relied on for stability. She laughed at something he said that wasn't particularly funny. The sound lingered warm and intentional. Her hand briefly touched his arm as she spoke, a gesture that might have seemed harmless to anyone watching. Daniel noticed immediately. The contact was brief, but it left him unsettled, as if something had been implied without being spoken aloud. Around them, conversations flowed freely, people unaware of the subtle shift occurring in this small pocket of space. Daniel felt exposed, despite being surrounded. He adjusted his stance, increasing the distance between them. But Melissa stepped closer without appearing to do so. It was subtle, practiced. He wondered how many times she had controlled a room without raising her voice. She mentioned how reliable he was, how his consistency stood out. Compliments weren't unusual, but the way she framed them felt personal, almost intimate. She spoke of trust, of loyalty, of how difficult it was to find people who truly understood responsibility. Each word landed heavier than the last, and Daniel felt a quiet alarm begin to ring in his chest. He nodded, unsure how to redirect the conversation without causing offense. The power dynamic was impossible to ignore. Melissa wasn't just a colleague, she was his boss. Every response carried weight. He chose his words carefully, emphasizing professionalism, gratefulness, neutrality. Still, her expression suggested she was listening for something else entirely. As the conversation paused, Melissa studied him for a second too long. The room noise rushed back into Daniel's awareness, sharp and overwhelming. He felt the first real crack in the image he had of her, controlled, predictable, contained. Whatever was forming beneath the surface had been there longer than he realized, and now it was beginning to press outward. Melissa didn't ask again. She simply placed a hand lightly on Daniel's elbow and guided him down the hallway, away from the noise and bright lights. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then followed, telling himself it was probably about work. The corridor was quieter, carpet muting their steps. Each pace felt heavier than the last, his awareness sharpening with every second of distance from the crowd. They stopped near the restrooms, the sign glowing softly against the wall. Melissa glanced around, checking that no one was nearby, then opened the door and stepped inside. Daniel froze, confusion flashing across his face. "Melissa," he started, but she was already gesturing for him to come in. The door closed behind them with a dull click that sounded louder than it should have. The space was narrow, tiled, faintly scented with soap and disinfectant. The noise from the event disappeared completely, replaced by a hum from the overhead lights. Daniel stood near the door, hands at his sides, unsure where to look. This was no longer ambiguous. Whatever this was, it wasn't routine and it wasn't appropriate. Melissa turned to face him, her expression unreadable. She took a step closer, lowering her voice until it barely carried. The proximity made the air feel thick, uncomfortable. Daniel felt his heart rate spike, not from desire, but from the sudden awareness of risk, careers, reputations, stability. All of it felt fragile in this small, enclosed room. "This stays between us," she whispered. The words were calm, controlled, rehearsed. They landed hard, heavier than a command. Daniel didn't respond. He searched her face for clarity, for explanation, but found none. The statement wasn't a question, and it wasn't an invitation. It was a line drawn without context. His mind raced through consequences he didn't yet understand. He shifted his weight, creating distance where little existed. "I don't think this is appropriate," he said quietly, careful not to let his voice rise. The silence that followed felt deliberate, as if she were measuring his response, adjusting something internally. Melissa held his gaze, unflinching. She didn't argue or apologize. Instead, she nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a variable she had accounted for. The tension lingered, unresolved, pressing against the walls. Daniel realized this moment would not end neatly, no matter how quickly it passed. She stepped back, opening the door and letting the noise spill in again. Just like that, the room lost its intensity, but the weight of what had happened remained. Daniel walked out first, his face composed, his thoughts anything but. The crowd swallowed him whole, unaware that something irreversible had just been set in motion. Daniel stepped back into the main hall with a face he hoped looked neutral. The music felt louder now, the lights harsher. Conversations brushed past him, meaningless noise crashing against thoughts he couldn't slow down. He picked up his untouched drink, just to have something in his hand, grounding himself in the cold glass. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything felt unstable, as if one wrong move could expose what had just happened. He replayed the moment again and again, not searching for drama, but for clarity. Had he misread it? Had he crossed a line simply by following her? The words echoed in his head, precise and controlled. "This stays between us." They weren't aggressive, yet they carried authority. He understood power well enough to recognize it when it spoke softly instead of loudly. Daniel scanned the room without meaning to, half expecting Melissa to appear beside him again. When he finally spotted her, she was exactly where she should be, laughing lightly with senior staff, posture flawless, expression calm, no sign of tension, no trace of what had happened. The contrast made his stomach tighten. If she could step back into that role so easily, what did that mean for him? He thought about his job, the years it had taken to build some sense of security. Flexible hours, decent pay, health coverage, things that mattered more when you were responsible for someone else. Ethan's face surfaced in his mind, uninvited but persistent. Stability wasn't abstract for Daniel. It was bedtime routines, school mornings, knowing rent would be paid next month. At the same time, something inside him resisted the idea of silence. Not anger, not pride, something quieter. A sense that allowing this to pass without acknowledgement meant accepting a version of reality he didn't agree with. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet he was the one calculating risk, adjusting behavior, shrinking himself to fit the aftermath. People smiled at him as they passed, colleagues who trusted him, who saw him as dependable. He wondered how many of them were carrying similar moments, hidden compromises that never made it into conversation. The thought made him feel isolated, even in a crowded room. Integrity suddenly felt like a private burden, invisible and heavy. Daniel checked his phone again, more out of habit than need, no new messages. Home felt far away, safe in a way this space no longer did. He considered leaving immediately, but worried that doing so might draw attention. Even his exit felt like something that had to be managed carefully now. As the event continued, Daniel remained physically present but emotionally withdrawn. Every decision seemed layered with consequence. He realized this wasn't a moment that would fade overnight. Whatever had been set in motion didn't require witnesses to be real. It lived in implication, in silence, and in the quiet pressure of what it might cost him to speak or not. Monday morning arrived with a deceptive sense of normalcy. Daniel walked into the office at his usual time, greeted by the familiar hum of keyboards and low conversation. His desk looked unchanged, the inbox already filling with routine requests. For a moment, he wondered if the event had been a distortion born of stress. But then he saw Melissa through the glass of her office, calm and focused, and the memory settled back into place, sharp and undeniable. No one mentioned the event. Not in passing, not in jokes near the coffee machine. It was as if the evening had been erased from collective memory. Daniel answered emails, attended stand-ups, delivered updates. He did everything the same, yet felt as though he were moving through a space with new, invisible boundaries. Silence wasn't neutral anymore. It felt structured, enforced by something no one named. The first shift was small. A meeting he usually attended was rescheduled without him. No explanation, no apology. Later that day, a task he'd been leading for months was reassigned, framed as a strategic adjustment. Melissa delivered the update professionally, her tone neutral, her eyes steady. Daniel nodded, telling himself not to read into it, even as his chest tightened. When their paths crossed in the hallway, Melissa acknowledged him with a polite smile. Nothing more. No tension, no familiarity. It was almost impressive how cleanly she maintained the facade. Yet Daniel noticed the glances, brief, assessing, when she thought he wasn't looking. They weren't hostile, but they carried awareness. A reminder that something existed between them, even if it was never spoken. Assignments continued to shift. More oversight, more check-ins framed as support. Daniel felt watched in a way he hadn't before, not scrutinized for mistakes, but observed for compliance. The message wasn't explicit, but it was consistent. He began documenting his work more carefully, saving emails, noting timelines, habits he'd never needed before. At lunch, co-workers chatted freely, unaware of the tension Daniel carried quietly. He laughed at the right moments, contributed when expected. But he felt detached, as if he were observing his own routine from a distance. Trust felt fragile now, something that could be leveraged rather than assumed. At home, the strain followed him. He found himself distracted during dinner, slower to respond, more tired than usual. Ethan asked if work was busy again, and Daniel nodded, offering a smile he didn't fully feel. He hated that the weight of something unspoken was seeping into the one place that was supposed to feel safe. By the end of the week, Daniel understood the rules without them ever being stated. Nothing had to be said for the shift to be real. Power didn't announce itself. It adjusted quietly, expecting recognition. And in that quiet adjustment, Daniel realized that pretending nothing had changed was no longer an option, because everything had. Daniel felt the pressure most clearly when the front door closed behind him at night. Work stayed at work in theory, but lately it followed him home in the form of silence and fatigue. He moved through routines on autopilot, dinner, dishes, checking homework, while his thoughts lagged behind. Ethan noticed before Daniel did. Kids always did. The questions became more frequent, the looks more searching, as if he were sensing cracks Daniel hadn't admitted to himself. One evening, Ethan asked why Daniel seemed far away. The question landed harder than any meeting or reassigned task. Daniel paused, unsure how to answer without lying or oversharing. He offered something vague about being tired, about work being complicated. Ethan accepted it with a nod, but the disappointment was clear. Daniel hated that his uncertainty was becoming visible, that the stability he worked so hard to protect felt thinner by the day. Sleep became restless. Daniel woke up before his alarm, mind already racing through conversations that hadn't happened yet. He replayed moments from the office, searching for mistakes, missed signals, anything he could have handled differently. Exhaustion made everything heavier. Simple decisions felt loaded. Even choosing what to cook for dinner felt like something that could go wrong. Mornings were worse. The rush to get Ethan ready for school collided with Daniel's growing sense of urgency at work. He snapped once over a misplaced shoe, then immediately regretted it. The apology came fast, but the guilt lingered. He promised himself it wouldn't happen again, knowing how easily stress had begun to override patience. He started questioning the trade-offs he'd made over the years. The long hours, the compromises, the belief that endurance equaled responsibility. Was stability just about paying bills and keeping routines intact? Or was it also about presence, honesty, and emotional safety? Daniel wasn't sure anymore. The lines felt blurred, distorted by pressure he hadn't chosen. On weekends he tried to compensate, extra time at the park, longer conversations before bed. But even then, part of him remained distracted, alert to emails, to Monday morning. Ethan sensed it. He leaned closer, talked more, as if trying to anchor Daniel in the moment. The realization that his child was adapting to him instead of the other way around, cut deep. Daniel found himself imagining the future more often, not in terms of promotions or security, but in smaller moments, school events, late-night talks, trust. He wondered what Ethan would remember about this time. A father who was present but distant, or one who chose honesty over convenience? The questions stayed with him long after the lights were turned off. By the end of the week, Daniel understood that the pressure wasn't contained anymore. It had spilled into everything, reshaping how he saw himself. Stability, he realized, wasn't just something you maintained quietly. Sometimes it required difficult choices, ones that risked disruption in the short term to protect something deeper in the long run. The email arrived late in the afternoon, framed as an opportunity. Melissa asked Daniel to stop by her office after hours to discuss alignment. The phrasing was neutral, familiar, yet the timing wasn't. He read it twice, then a third time, feeling the familiar tightening in his chest. There was no explicit request, nothing he could point to as inappropriate, but the pattern was unmistakable. Ambiguity had become the method. He considered replying with a scheduling conflict, something about needing to leave early. He hovered over the keyboard, then stopped. Avoidance had worked only in the smallest ways so far, and even then, it had come with quiet penalties. Declining now felt like stepping further into a game he hadn't agreed to play. He replied simply, confirming he would come by. Melissa's office was dimmer than usual, the blinds half drawn. She gestured for him to sit, maintaining a professional distance, but her tone carried an undercurrent Daniel had learned to recognize. She spoke about trust, about discretion, about how certain situations required maturity rather than escalation. The words were careful, polished, leaving space for interpretation without ever stating intent. She referenced his workload, hinting that upcoming changes could go either way depending on cooperation. Not as a threat, not as a promise. Just information, delivered calmly. Daniel listened, nodding when expected, but something shifted inside him. The pressure was no longer theoretical. It was directional. It was asking him to accept terms without ever naming them. He realized then that silence wasn't neutral anymore. By saying nothing, by continuing to play along, he was participating. The thought unsettled him more than confrontation ever had. He thought of Ethan, of the quiet questions at dinner, of the example he was setting through inaction as much as action. When the meeting ended, Melissa smiled politely, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Daniel stood, thanked her, and left the office with measured steps. In the hallway, he paused, steadying himself. The realization was clear and uncomfortable. Doing nothing was a decision, and it was costing him more each day. That night, sleep didn't come easily. He replayed the conversation, this time without doubt. The line had been crossed not through a single act, but through accumulation. Each subtle shift, each unspoken expectation had led here. The situation no longer allowed for passive endurance. By morning, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: clarity. It didn't bring relief, but it brought direction. He understood now that avoiding consequences wasn't possible anymore. The only choice left was which consequences he was willing to face, and which ones he wasn't. Daniel sat alone at his kitchen table long after Ethan had gone to bed, the house quiet in a way that felt heavier than usual. A legal pad lay in front of him, mostly blank. He had written and crossed out the same phrases repeatedly, unable to settle on a clean version of the truth. Every option branched into consequences he could already feel pressing against his chest. Protecting his job meant shrinking himself further. Speaking up meant stepping into uncertainty with no guarantee of safety. He thought about the practicalities first, because that was how he'd learned to survive. Rent, school fees, health insurance. The math was unforgiving. Losing stability would ripple outward, touching Ethan before it ever fully reached him. Daniel hated that reality, hated how easily fear could masquerade as responsibility. He wondered how many people stayed silent, not because they agreed, but because they were afraid of what honesty would cost. Then there was the other side, the quiet erosion he'd been feeling for weeks, the constant vigilance, the way his shoulders never fully relaxed, the knowledge that compliance would not end the situation, only redefine it. Integrity wasn't abstract anymore. It showed up in small moments, in how he answered questions, in what he tolerated. He asked himself how long he could live divided without something breaking. Daniel considered reporting the situation formally. The process felt daunting, impersonal, slow. He imagined being questioned, doubted, reduced to documentation. Power rarely revealed itself cleanly, and he knew how easily narratives could be reframed. Still, the idea of naming what had happened brought a strange sense of steadiness, like standing on solid ground after weeks of imbalance. He thought about Ethan again, this time not as a responsibility, but as a witness. Children absorbed more than words. They learned from patterns, from what adults accepted as normal. Daniel wondered what lessons silence would teach. That security mattered more than self-respect. That boundaries were flexible when authority was involved. The answers made his stomach tighten. Morning came without resolution, but something had shifted. Daniel dressed more slowly, deliberately. At work, he completed his tasks with care, documenting everything as he went. The ordinary rhythm of the day felt almost surreal, as if it belonged to a life he might soon outgrow. When Melissa passed his desk, their eyes met briefly. There was no challenge in her expression, only expectation. By mid-afternoon, Daniel knew the decision couldn't wait for certainty. There would be none. He requested a meeting with HR, keeping the message factual and restrained. His finger hovered over the send button for a long moment. This wasn't courage in the dramatic sense. It was exhaustion paired with resolve, the kind that comes when avoidance has run out of room. When he finally clicked send, nothing immediate happened, no alarms, no relief. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had begun. Daniel leaned back in his chair, breathing slowly. He didn't know what the outcome would be, only that the path ahead, however unstable, was his to walk honestly. That evening, at home, he listened more carefully as Ethan talked about his day. He asked questions, stayed present, felt grounded in a way he hadn't in weeks. The risks were still there, real and looming. But for the first time, Daniel felt aligned with himself, and that alignment carried a strength he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The weeks that followed unfolded without drama, but not without consequence. Meetings were held, statements taken, timelines reviewed. Daniel answered questions carefully, sticking to facts, resisting the urge to justify his feelings. The process was slow, procedural, and often impersonal. Some days he left work feeling lighter, other days completely drained. There were no clear villains or heroes, just a system trying to correct itself without admitting how fragile it really was. Melissa was placed on leave during the review. The office reacted quietly. Speculation kept behind closed doors. No one asked Daniel direct questions, but the atmosphere shifted again, this time unevenly. Some colleagues grew distant, unsure of where to place him. Others were subtly kinder, more attentive. The change reminded Daniel that accountability rarely arrives cleanly. It ripples outward, touching people who never chose to be involved. Professionally, nothing returned to what it had been. Opportunities slowed, advancement became uncertain, yet something else emerged in the absence of ambition-driven momentum: clarity. Daniel worked without second-guessing his posture or his words. He spoke plainly in meetings, set boundaries without apology. The constant tension that had lived in his body for months gradually loosened, replaced by a cautious steadiness. At home, the difference was more immediate. Daniel slept better. He listened without distraction. When Ethan asked questions, he answered honestly, in ways appropriate but real. There was no dramatic speech, no explanation of adult complexities, just presence, just consistency. The house felt calmer, not because problems had disappeared, but because they were no longer being carried in silence. There were moments of doubt, late nights when bills felt heavier, when the future looked narrower than it once had. Daniel allowed himself those moments without shame. Resilience, he learned, wasn't about optimism. It was about endurance without self-betrayal, about choosing to stay intact even when outcomes were uncertain. Eventually, the review concluded. The resolution was measured, careful, unsatisfying in some ways. Policies were reinforced, lines were clarified. No public reckoning followed. Daniel accepted that. Justice, he realized, often looks less like closure and more like prevention. What mattered most was that the pattern had been interrupted, even if quietly. One afternoon, while walking Ethan home from school, Daniel noticed how easily conversation flowed. There was laughter, small complaints, plans for the weekend. Nothing extraordinary, and yet it felt like a victory of its own kind. The future wasn't guaranteed, but it felt honest, built on choices he could stand behind. Daniel didn't come out unscathed. Parts of his old trajectory had broken, and they wouldn't be rebuilt the same way. But what stayed was more important: his sense of self, his integrity, and the knowledge that he had chosen alignment over fear. In the end, that quiet resilience became the foundation for whatever came next.